His voice was deep, harsh, and loaded with an intense inner struggle that made me freeze in place. He moved closer to me, his stare steady as if the world had vanished and just the two of us remained. Anna. I stood motionless in the living room, every nerve in my body torturing me as if it were stretched to its breaking point. The only sound that broke the oppressive silence was the heavy breathing that filled the space between us. The distance between us closed until I could feel the warmth of his breath brushing against my skin. I couldn't stop thinking about you. He said each word, slicing through the already oppressive tension. I didn't turn my face away for a single day or moment, but his presence was so overwhelming that I couldn't ignore it. "We can't do this, Liam," I whispered, my voice trembling as if I didn't believe what I was saying. "We crossed that line a long time ago, and you know it." His tone remained steady, but his steps brought him closer, and his hand lifted, grazing my shoulder with a touch so gentle yet so searing it sent heat coursing through me. I should have pushed him away. His lips suddenly met mine, softly but fervently, as if he were torn between holding on and letting go. My heart seemed to stop, only to ignite moments later, drawing me into an uncontrollable whirlwind of emotions. I should have run, but my feet felt anchored to the ground, refusing to obey. I knew this was wrong. The room seemed to disappear, leaving only the two of us and the dangerous intimacy of the kiss. But just as I was sinking deeper, a sharp gust of wind slammed the back door against the frame. The noise forced me back to reality like a cold slap across the face, and I pushed Liam away, panicking. "No, we can't do this," I cried. I knew I shouldn't, but every ounce of logic dissolved, leaving me bare before the undeniable truth. "This will ruin everything." Liam looked at me, his face hurting as if he was trying to find the right words to break down the wall between us, but couldn't find any. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice hollow and broken, but I couldn't change how I felt, so I turned my back on him and let the tears fall, shattering like glass as they fell. The door closed behind him, and I was left standing there by myself in a quiet that was blazing with resentment. I heard his footsteps retreating slowly and heavily, each one digging further into my chest. When the door shut behind Liam, I fell into the couch, my hands clutching my face as the weight of everything fell on me. I realized then that everything had changed. There was no turning back, and I didn't know how to go. How? The answer seemed to be buried deep in a maze of overlapping memories, fractured moments, and small decisions that had led me to this irrevocable point. It didn't start today. Rather, it started long ago on the day I first met Liam, when my husband David introduced him to me. If I had allowed things to get to this point, I would have asked myself that question countless times. I remember the moment clearly. Liam is tall and lean, his tousled brown hair catching the sunlight, his piercing blue eyes tinged with a hint of shyness. David stood proudly beside him, one hand on his son's shoulder, his face glowing with fatherly pride. "Anna, this is Liam," my son David said warmly, his voice filled with love. I smiled politely, hiding the awkwardness bubbling inside me. Becoming a stepmother had never been part of my life plan, and the fact that Liam was only 12 years younger than me blurred the boundaries of our relationship from the start. At that time, Liam had just returned home after a tough year living on his own. Nothing seemed to be going right for him. Unstable jobs, dwindling finances, and a strained relationship with his biological mother. David, ever the compassionate protector of his family, suggested that Liam move in with us at the ranch to start fresh. I agreed, thinking it was the best thing for him. Little did I know that decision would alter the course of my life forever. In the beginning, Liam and I were distant. He was reserved, offering only brief greetings and spending most of his time holed up in his room. I didn't blame him. I understood how uncomfortable it must be for a young man to have a stranger suddenly thrust into the role of stepmother. I didn't try to bridge the gap, thinking that time would naturally help us grow closer. But as the days turned into weeks, the distance between us only seemed to solidify. Everything shifted one sweltering summer day when David left for an extended work trip, leaving me and Liam alone at the ranch. I vividly remember the heat pressing down like a heavy blanket as I wrestled with a pile of dishes in the kitchen. Liam walked in carrying an old wooden chair he'd found in the "Should you want me to fix this?" he asked, his tone calm but tinged with hesitation. I looked up at him surprised. He rarely initiated conversation. This old thing. I pointed to the chair belonged to my mother. I didn't think it was salvageable. Liam shrugged, a faint smile playing on his lips. I like a challenge, he replied. And with that he set to work on the chair in the backyard under the relentless summer sun. I watched him from the window, and inexplicable warmth blossoming inside me. For the first time I saw Liam not as a lost young man, but as someone patient, thoughtful, and capable, a man I hadn't truly noticed before. From that day forward, we began to talk more. At first our conversations were casual and mundane, revolving around chores or plans for the ranch. But gradually they deepened. I found myself sharing dreams I'd long dreamed of, becoming an artist, dreams I'd abandoned for the sake of practically. Liam in turn opened up about his struggles, the weight of expectations from David, the tense relationship with his mother, and the uncertainty of his path. We discovered a mutual understanding, a bond that grew stronger with every conversation. But that bond also brought emotions I wasn't prepared for. I began to look forward to our conversations, even if they were brief, in the kitchen or the backyard. I noticed how Liam moved, how he smiled softly when I spoke, and how his eyes lingered just a moment too long when they met mine. I tried to tell myself that these feelings were all a lie, but I knew deep down that I was lying to myself. Every time David came home, I felt like I was hiding a huge secret, not because I had done anything wrong, but because my heart was subtly moving towards someone I had no right to love. Now, as I sat there in the aftermath of what had happened, I couldn't help but think back to the past. What had brought me here? Was it loneliness? What happened with Liam wasn't an accident. It was the inevitable result of cracks in my life that I had ignored for far too long. And now I was left to face the consequences of a reality I never anticipated. The next few days at the ranch were a blur of emotions, confusion, guilt, and longing, all tangled into a web that I couldn't unravel. Was it the emotional disconnect with David? Or was it something buried within me that I had been avoiding for too long? I made an effort to act as if nothing had happened. So I busied myself with chores, stayed out of Liam's way, and avoided places where I knew he would be. However, Liam avoided me as well. He was too cold, courteous, and distant, retreating into himself in a way that made the silence between us unbearable. He didn't meet my gaze, didn't linger in the rooms where I was, but the memory of his touch, his words, and the look in his eyes didn't go away. If anything, it only got stronger, burning at my resolve and making me question every choice I had ever made. One evening, when the summer heat gave way to a cooler breeze, I found myself in the garden pruning the overgrown rose bushes. Although it was a straightforward task that I usually enjoyed, my thoughts were too loud tonight, and I didn't hear Liam approach until he was directly behind me. "Anna," he said softly, startling me out of my reverie. I turned to face him, and for a brief moment we just stood there, the air between us heavy with unsaid words. "What is it?" I tried to speak steadily as I inquired, "Liam," but he paused, his hands twitching at his sides. I wanted to apologize for what had occurred. "You know that, right?" He nodded, but his expression was tortured. "I know, but that doesn't change how I feel, Liam." His words hung in the air, wrapping around me like a vice. "It wasn't right, and it's my fault. I shouldn't have," he trailed off, his eyes dropping to the ground. "It wasn't just your fault," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "But it can't happen again." I had to tell it, Anna, but he interrupted me. He stopped himself and shook his head, saying, "I need you to know that I hate myself for loving you more than I should." "Is it Liam?" I said in a quivering voice. We can't. I can't just turn it off," even though I know he stated his voice was breaking. My eyes began to flood up with tears, but I forced myself to hold back. "You have to try, Liam, we both do this. This can't destroy everything," he said, nodding once more while clenching his teeth. "I will avoid getting in your way. I swear, I'll make things simpler for you." "Thank you." That night, I couldn't sleep, so I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every word, every look, every touch. I knew Liam was right to distance himself, and I knew I had to do the same. But the thought of losing him, of erasing whatever it was we had shared, was too painful. I whispered, though the words felt hollow, and I watched him turn and walk away, his shoulders slumping, his steps heavy. I had never felt so seen, so understood, and the loss of that connection felt like losing a part of myself over the next few days. Liam kept his promise. He avoided me, completely leaving the room whenever I entered, staying out late to work on the fences or repairs around the property. David returned from his trip cheerful and unaware of the storm raging beneath the surface. He kissed my cheek, told me how much he had missed me, and I smiled and pretended everything was fine, but everything wasn't. Fine. The distance between me and Liam didn't make things easier. It made them harder. The space between us was filled with tension, with longing, with 1,000 words left unsaid. I felt like I was suffocating, trapped in a life I didn't know how to fix. One afternoon when David was out running errands, I found Liam in the barn repairing a broken stool door. I hesitated at the entrance, watching him work. He looked tired, his movements slow and deliberate. For a moment I considered leaving, but something kept me rooted in place. "Liam," I said softly. Stepping inside, he looked up startled and then quickly averted his eyes. "Anna," he said, his voice tight, "what are you doing here?" I stated in a trembling voice, "I need to talk to you, but I can't." He groaned and put down his tools, saying, "I can't keep acting like nothing's wrong. There's nothing to talk about. We both know what we have to do, but that doesn't make it any easier," I replied, stepping closer to Liam. "I don't wish to lose you. I'm not leaving you. I'm right," he said, his voice cracking. "I just can't be what you need me to be right now." As I drew closer to you, tears ran down my cheeks. He continued in a distressed voice, "You have David. You have a life. I can't take that away from you. You're not taking anything I said. I'm the one who stopped choking on my words. I don't know what I need anymore," I confessed, "but I know this thing between us is real. Doesn't mean it's right. Am I the one who allowed this to occur?" For a moment, we stood with the weight of our emotions pressing down on us. Then Liam stepped back, his hand falling to his side, and he said, "I'm leaving," in a firm voice. "It's the only way." "No," I said, panic rising in my chest. "You don't have to." "Yes, I do," he interrupted, "for both of our sakes." I closed my eyes and leaned into his touch. "I care about you, Anna. I always will, but we can't do this. You know that." "I know," I whispered, "but it doesn't make it any less painful." I was unable to. I stayed there for a long time after he left, the stillness surrounding me deafening. And I convinced David that everything was great as he packed his belongings and went out of the barn into the waning sunshine. I smiled and kissed him and pretended our life was perfect. But deep down I knew I'd lost something I could never get back, and yet I also knew it was the only way forward for both of us, for all of us. The days following that fateful evening was a storm of tension, regret, and emotions. I couldn't fully comprehend. Everything between Liam and me had shifted irreversibly. An invisible wall of awkwardness and unspoken feelings had settled between us, suffocating any attempt at normally. Our once casual conversations had dwindled into fleeting glances and deliberate silence, each of us avoiding the other as if that alone could undo what had already been done. I tried to immerse myself in the rhythms of daily life, clinging to chores and routines like lifelines. Yet I couldn't stop thinking about him, about the way he looked at me, as though he saw through every mask I wore. It was an intensity one had never felt before, not even with David. Every time I heard Liam's footsteps in the hallway or caught sight of him working outside through the window, my chest tightened with a mixture of longing and guilt. Liam had changed too. He was no longer the relaxed, approachable figure who had casually fixed broken furniture or exchanged light-hearted banter. He kept his distance. His demeanor guarded, his presence shadowed by a palpable discomfort. Still, I could feel his gaze linger on me from across the room or the yard, fleeting but charged, as though he couldn't help himself even though he knew he should. One evening as we sat at the dinner table with David, the tension was unbearable. David, oblivious to the undercurrents between us, chatted away cheerfully about his work and upcoming projects. I nodded along, trying to match his enthusiasm, but my mind was elsewhere. Liam remained mostly silent, picking at his food and barely looking up. The atmosphere was thick enough to choke on, and I felt like any misstep would shatter the fragile facade we were clinging. After dinner, David retreated upstairs to work in his study, leaving me to clean up in the kitchen. I welcomed the solitude but wasn't alone for long. Liam lingered near the doorway, his presence a quiet storm behind me. The silence stretched heavy and oppressive until I couldn't bear it anymore. "Liam," I said, my voice trembling despite my attempt to sound composed. "We need to talk for a moment." He didn't respond when he finally spoke. His voice was low and raw, I don't think there's anything to say. I turned to face him, and our eyes met in his gaze. I saw everything, his pain, his regret, and the feelings he could no longer suppressing. Liam, we can't go on like this. We need to figure this out. His chuckle was quick and unexpected, and it was sour. Do you think I'm unaware of that? I don't wake up every day, do you think? I never meant to hurt you. His words hit me like a physical blow, and I cringed, tears burning my eyes, loathing myself for what I've done and what we've done. I tried to avoid him. But you're here, Anna, I replied in a barely audible whisper. His tone softened but was still filled with agony. He paused, taking a trembling breath, and said, "You're always here. I can't stop thinking about how your tears fell down my cheeks while I tried to find the proper words. Liam, I'm sorry. I don't know how to make this right." He took a step closer, and suddenly the space between us seemed unbearably small. "You're not the only one who doesn't know," he murmured. His voice barely a whisper for a heartbeat. We stood there caught in a moment that felt like it could stretch forever. I knew I should step back and draw a line. But I couldn't move. The pull between us was too strong, too overwhelming. But then the sound of David's footsteps echoed down the hallway. Liam immediately stepped back and I turned away, busying myself with the dishes as though nothing had happened. When David entered blissfully unaware, I exhaled a shaky breath of relief. But deep down I knew that moment had changed everything. The days that followed were even more excruciating. Liam and I avoided each other entirely, each of us retreating into our own corners of the house. But the distance didn't make things easier, it made them worse. The unspoken words, the unresolved emotions, they festered in the silence, growing heavier with each passing day. I couldn't stop thinking about him, about the way he looked at me with such raw vulnerability. And I hated myself for it, for the pain I was causing him, and for the feelings I couldn't seem to suppress. One afternoon while David was out meeting with a client, I sat alone in the living room, trying and failing to focus on a book. The home was so silent that I felt my heart sink as I heard Liam's footsteps approaching. He paused at the threshold and hesitated for a second before entering. "Could we speak?" he inquired in a firm voice that had a hint of something I couldn't quite identify. He sat across from me, his hands clutched firmly, his knuckles white as if he were keeping himself together by pure willpower. I nodded, putting the book aside as he whispered, "I'm leaving." And the words struck me like a kick to the stomach. "You don't have to, Liam," I began, but he interrupted. "Yes, I do," he responded firmly. "Anna, I can't stay here." David's life and my own tears clouded my eyes, but I didn't attempt to stop them. "Liam, please," I pleaded. "I feel like I'm destroying everything in your life every day that I'm here." He shook his head, his face determined. "I can't, and you know it. We can figure this out. You don't have to go." I knew he was right, so I didn't argue, but the prospect of losing him was too much to handle. "Liam, this is unfair to everyone." "I'm sorry," I said, my voice breaking. "I never wanted to hurt you." "Didn't," he said, his voice softening, "not intentionally. And you're the most amazing person I've ever known, Anna. But staying here will only make things worse." I watched as he stood, his movements deliberate as though he was trying to hold himself together. "Thank you," he said quietly, and then he was gone. I sat there long after he left, the silence of the house pressing down on me like a weight. The pain was suffocating, but I knew he was right. This was the only way to salvage what was left of our lives. It was the only way to move forward, even if it felt like I was leaving a piece of myself behind after Liam said he would leave. I sat quietly in the living room, feeling as though everything in my life was being swept into the storm. Silence filled the house, but inside me a whirlwind of emotions raged. Love, guilt, and loss are all interwoven and crushing my heart. I knew Liam was right, that his leaving was the only way to keep everything from collapsing, yet the thought of never seeing him again felt like losing a vital part of my life. That evening when David returned home, I tried to greet him with a smile, as I always did. He stepped into the house, placed his coat on the rack and his briefcase on the table, still the devoted and loving man I had vowed to protect at all costs. He looked at me with the kind of trust that I knew I no longer deserved. I wanted to tell him everything, to confess my mistakes. But I couldn't. Not because I feared his judgment, but because I couldn't bear to destroy the life we had built together. "Is everything okay, Anna?" David inquired in a soft, worried voice, and I replied while attempting to conceal my internal conflict. "Yes, everything is all right. How was your job? Did you feel worn out today?" He sat down next to me and smiled. "It's okay, but I've been missing you lately." It seems like you've been a little aloof. Is there something going on? His inquiry made me think. David, I'm sorry, I replied, my voice shaking. But his voice was so genuine and full of love that I couldn't lie and grabbed for his hand, feeling the warmth and stability he gave into my life. I wanted to say no, to reassure him that everything was well. I apologize for not giving you the time and consideration you merit, and I swear to do better. His words were like a dagger to my heart. I didn't deserve his love, but I knew I had to protect it. I had to do everything to make up for my mistakes and ensure I would never repeat them the next day. Liam packed his things and got ready to leave, and I stood by the window watching as he loaded his suitcase into the car. I'll do better, he said, his eyes soft and reassuring, and I felt like everything inside me was shattering. Although I knew it would just make things more difficult, I chose to stand quietly and let the tears fall down my cheeks. Just as Liam was ready to get into his car, he stopped and glanced up at the window. Where I stood, our eyes met, and in that moment every emotion we had shared was laid bare. I said nothing, only gave him a small nod, a final goodbye, an acknowledgement that this was the only way to end things. Liam smiled faintly, a bittersweet expression filled with both sadness and relief. He got into the car and drove away, leaving me standing there feeling as though a piece of me had left with him. But I knew this was the right thing to do. It was the only way for both of us to move forward. As time passed, I focused on my life with David. We spent more time together taking walks, enjoying dinners and sharing stories we had neglected before I learned to love him again, not with the passionate excitement of our early days, but with a deep sense of appreciation and commitment that could only come from years of shared life. Yet no matter how much I tried, memories of Liam didn't entirely fade. Sometimes as I stood in the kitchen I'd think of his gaze, his smile, and the way he made me feel like a woman truly seen. But I also knew that those memories were just a fragment of my story, a piece that I couldn't allow to define me. Since life is ultimately defined by the decisions we make, no matter how challenging, and I knew deep down that I had made the right decision, I stayed to protect what I had built with David and forgive myself. I never saw Liam again, but I hoped he found the peace and happiness he deserved.